coming to this event organized by Genocide Prevention Program and Program on History, Memory and Conflict. We have our speaker today, Mark van Berkel from the Netherlands. Mark teaches European history at Han University for Applied Sciences, and since 2011 he is also a research associate at the Center for Historical Culture at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam. He will present to us on the Holocaust representations, and he is seeking to compare portrayals of the Holocaust in the history textbooks in the Netherlands and the West German state between 1960 and 2010. And also we'll talk about the perpetrator and victim narratives in those history textbooks. So Mark, I give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Borislava, and thank you for inviting me for your lunch break. I am actually professor of history, contemporary history in the Netherlands. And I started the research on this topic, as you said, 2 years ago. So my presentation will probably add up with a few more questions, and then I'll provide you with answers. So I hope that doesn't stop the discussion on the talks we're having. Could you, in short, tell me who you are? I know Borislava and I know now the other guys. Are you students, or what kind of subjects do you do?
Hello, my name is Tetsushi Ogata. I'm a director of Genocide Prevention Program at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and I also do a PhD in Genocide Studies. So this is a topic that I'm interested in.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, my name is Ernest. I'm originally from Nigeria. I'm also a PhD student, and prior to starting my PhD here, I used to work for the International Committee of the Red Cross in Nigeria. So okay. I have been working with victims of war, basically providing humanitarian assistance to people that were affected by conflict in Nigeria.
All right. Interesting. Right.
I'm Eliukovic. I'm from the Balkans. I'm a master student here, and beside it, I'm operating with IT video equipment. Like kind of interesting because of the, I would say, the Balkan conflicts and all the, I would say, unnecessary victims over there. So thank you for presentation.
Okay, thank you.
We have one more. If you want to introduce yourself.
Yes. Hi.
Hi, how are you? My name's Sarah. I'm a doctoral student here doing my dissertation on the French rail case related to the deportation of the Jews and the class action lawsuit coming out of the U.S. So
Okay.
I'm looking at how the lawsuit actually constrains perpetrator and victim narratives. So.
Oh, that's interesting. Right. Well, as I've shown on the first slide, I'm interested in perpetrator and victim narratives in textbooks in the Netherlands and West Germany between 1960 and 2010. What I intend to do tonight is to, elaborate a bit more on my research topic for about 25 minutes, and then I hope we'll have a discussion on the questions I raised. Can you see the second slide as well?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Well, let me begin with saying that the Holocaust and World War II in the Netherlands is a very big issue. It's very typical in collective memory in the Netherlands, as it is in Germany, of course. Why I picked these two countries is because, well, I'm Dutch. That's one reason. And the second reason is that we're living in close to the Dutch-German border, so it's only 5 miles from where I work. And we've got a lot of German students coming over to Holland and study history. And they are always struck by the differences in reflection upon World War II and the Holocaust, because they tend to perceive World War II from a perpetrator point of view in their textbooks. That's what they tell me anyway. Whereas the Dutch tend to look at World War II from the perspective of victims. And this clash of, well, perspective basically, I found interesting. That's why I started this research in the first place. To give you an example how important, how actual the topic still is, I, out of curiosity, studied a couple of weekend editions of a large Dutch newspaper in September last year, and then the Holocaust in 3 editions, so in 3 weekends in September, was mentioned 38 times in this newspaper. Which is quite a lot, I think, because it was not a typical World War II remembrance weekend. It would be some date in May. And in September there wasn't much, there isn't a date which easily can be related to the Holocaust. So this is more or less an average mentioning of the war, and typically the Holocaust. Second, in Western Europe and in the Netherlands as well, World War II is a very important position in history curricula still, which means that in third grade students, so that would be students around 14, 15, 16-year-olds, have a large part of their history education dedicated to World War II. Only a small part of that is dedicated to the Holocaust, and in West Germany it's the other way around. So World War II is important there as well, but 60 to 70% of the curriculum, history curriculum, is dedicated to anti-Semitism, to the Holocaust, and to the build-up of the Holocaust. Thirdly, when you question teachers on how to deal with the Holocaust, they always found it very difficult. Of course, it's a very emotional subject. A lot of suffering is involved, and a lot of anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli sentiments are still strong in these parts of the world. That means that there are a lot of young people from Moroccan, Algerian, so Middle Eastern descent, non-Israeli of course, so Arabic origins or Turkish, and they are very persistently anti-Zionist, as you probably know. And they seem to connect the Holocaust, so history education, with the present political situation in the Middle East. Which means, for instance, meant that last week or 2 weeks ago, a couple of Turkish youngsters, so 15, 16-year-olds, were interviewed on national network television about their political views, and they were saying things like, we're sorry that Hitler stopped at 6 million Jews, because every dead Jew is a good Jew. Every Jew that is still alive has moved and emigrated to Israel, and you see what they do now with the Palestinians and with the Arabs. So it's a very complex subject, and even it leads to complete ignorance of the Holocaust in some schools, because some schools in Amsterdam, the capital, where there are a lot of immigrants, I know of at least 7 schools who refrain from dealing with the topic in history education. So they treat World War II without the Holocaust. So they just ignore the whole subject, afraid as they are of emotional distress among their students, or riots or whatever. So that's a difficult subject, and there was a survey a couple of years ago in England. There's a department of the University of London who surveyed about 600 teachers, and they asked them how they demonstrated the complexity of the Holocaust in their lessons. And I'm not sure about the numbers, but a large amount of these teachers, about 70–80%, said that textbooks were inadequate to deal with the subjects. So they taught the Holocaust through films, mainly the film Schindler's List. So that was their main teaching tool, through which they hoped to deal with the Holocaust as a subject in history education, which is surprising to me. How would that be in the United States?
how they teach it.
Yes.
With everything. I mean, movies, books, definitely novels, multiple movies. I mean, I don't remember when I first started learning about it, but once I started, it was fairly constant.
Okay.
Museum visits, I mean, Anne Frank, but multiple films.
Yeah. And how would you relate the films and the novels you read on the Holocaust in history educations to the use of textbooks?
Explain the question a little more. How would I relate? I mean,
Yeah.
how much is actually in the textbook?
What percentage of the time teachers dedicate to the Holocaust do they do that based on textbook information?
I don't remember my textbooks. Honestly, it has been far too long.
Yeah.
But I also went to a progressive school, so I don't know if I'm a good indicator for the United States in general.
Okay.
But
Yeah, I mean, we cannot say about the United States, but maybe we can say a little bit about our countries.
Yeah.
In Croatia, there is very little written in history textbooks on Holocaust. So mostly focuses on what happened in Croatia and in the Balkans, during the Second World War. So that there is a mention, but I guess not is it expansive?
No.
Yeah, in the Japanese case, and of course I'm one of the samples, so I'm not representing all of Japanese history education. But as far as I knew, the history education, there are many electives. The history on the world history class, Japanese history class, ancient Japanese history class, modern Japanese history class. So if you happen to choose world history as an elective to fulfill your history requirement, then you may come across the mention or history of Holocaust. But if you choose Asian history or other parts, then chances are very low. The chances of exposure to the history education about Holocaust is very low.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What about Nigeria?
Okay, well, I'm not a history major, so I'm not very familiar. But having worked with the Red Cross and Red Cross, like in Geneva, they have got this museum, where they display all this, all what happened maybe during the First World War or Second World War. It was at Geneva that I first saw, maybe paintings and other literatures about the Holocaust. But in Africa or in Nigeria, they talk more about maybe what happened in Rwanda and other countries within Africa, more than they talk about maybe what happened in Europe.
Yeah, I know. It's difficult to see. Sometimes, in recent years, the Holocaust has moved into a sort of universal symbol of evil, of genocide, and I find it difficult to see how non-Europeans or non-Western teachers can deal with the Holocaust related to a universal topic of, war, genocide, mass murder, and that's something we teachers in this part of the world consider to be very disturbing, because if you turn the Holocaust into a non-historical event like a universal symbol, that means that you sort of disattach yourself from a large part of the world, from teachers from a large part of the world, and from students from a large part of the world. I'll try and come to that later. Let's talk a bit about my research question until now, because I'm still working on the dissertation. What I'm trying to do is compare German and Dutch history textbooks between 1960 and 2010 in the way they show their perspectives on the Holocaust. And what I tried to do as well is to compare this perspective they are using to developments within historical culture in both countries. So that's a very complex topic as far as I'm concerned. So I'm still narrowing down a whole bit, but I chose the time limits 1916 2010 because before 1960 hardly anything was mentioned on the Holocaust before that time. So between 1945 and 1960, in both countries, textbooks didn't say much on the Holocaust. They either mentioned it in a sentence or they ignored it completely. The difficult thing with the German situation is that Germany, as you know, is a federal country, like the US is. And in every German state, and there are 16 German states, after reunification in 1989, every state has its own educational system, so its own curriculum. So if you would study history or have a history assignment in Bavaria, in the south, you would have a complete different textbook, complete different curriculum as in other parts of the country. So that's a bit of a problem. So I decided to concentrate on one of the states, which is actually quite near where we are. So and it's in size and population comparable to the Netherlands, which is around 60 million people, and they roughly have the same history curriculum. So what I'm dealing with, as you probably will as well, are notions on history, official history, or historical culture, and memory culture. And the thing with most historical events is that they get frequently discussed and analyzed and historically and scientifically portrayed in books and other items of public or historical culture within a certain time limit after they actually took place. For instance, Borislav, you're from Croatia. There were a lot of publication on the Yugoslav war after the 1990s, immediately after. Well, the same goes for a lot of historical Dutch topics or German topics. And then they sort of move away from the center of historical attention. But with the Holocaust, this was not the case, strangely enough. Because, like I said, for the first 15 years, both in historical culture, so in historical scholarship and in public culture, the Holocaust was, well, more or less ignored, not mentioned, not studied. There were, of course, eyewitnesses who published books or diaries. In fact, the icon of the Holocaust in the US, Anne Frank, as you know, from Amsterdam, originally from Germany, her diary was not even published in the Netherlands until the late 1950s. So actually Anne Frank became an icon of the Holocaust in the US and then was exported, her testimonies were exported again to Europe through plays and through the republishing of the diary in 1958, 1959. And of course, I think it was in 1955 that the Broadway play of Anne Frank's diary was a huge success in New York. So even in Israel, the Holocaust was basically ignored throughout the 1950s and the 1960s. Some people, like the US historical scholar Peter Novick, I'm sure you heard of him, he passed away last year. He wrote some interesting books on this phenomenon, and he tried to explain this ignorance through the fact that in Israeli politics, domestic politics, they tried to forget the Holocaust because they didn't want to portray themselves as victims of history. They wanted to look forward, to be more open towards the future, to re-establish or to establish a Jewish state on the ruins of the Palestinian Mandate in the 1950s and the 1960s. And this basically changed with the 6 Days War in 1967. Because then the Israelis believed that they could use the Holocaust, in the words of Novik, they could use the Holocaust to re-establish their national identity again. So here's when the Holocaust became instrumental in the way that it was becoming part of Jewish identity. That's where we came from, and now we're resisting foreign oppression or violence against Jews or anti-Semitic behavior or whatever. This was reinforced in 1973 with the Yom Kippur War, when they were attacked once more, and this led to the reinforcement of the Holocaust in history curricula in Israel in 1976. So what you basically have is that students who went to school in Israel before 1976 hardly ever heard something or read anything about the Holocaust in Israel, because it was not part of the curriculum. It was mentioned, but it wasn't studied, to be more specific. So what people normally do, if they refer to the Holocaust, is say that it's normal to repress traumatic events when you experience them. So this is a Freudian principle. So the Holocaust was so traumatic for Jewish survivors, or for people who witnessed it in Europe, or even for the perpetrators, that it's a normal act of human resistance, you could say, to repress that kind of traumatic events and try to forget about them and get on with your life. But this, Novik says, is not the case with the Holocaust, because here it seems that the reinvention of the Holocaust in the 1960s and 1970s is basically an orchestrated operation, mainly initiated by Jewish leaders in Israel, in the United States and in other countries. Because the Jewish victimhood had to become a central symbol of Jewish identity, because the Jewish state, Israel, was being threatened from, again, outside anti-Semitic or anti-Israeli or anti-Zionist forces. So, what does it say about the situation in Germany and the Netherlands? Well, the standard narrative in Germany is that Germany became denazified, democratic and transnational, multi-pluralistic, you could say, after 1945. Under American pressure, or Allied pressure, as you have to put it. But anyway, they were becoming part of the Western system, becoming democratic, liberal, capitalistic, part of the Western Hemisphere, as you say. Especially, of course, this goes for the western part of the country, West Germany. The Germans became, of course, or were raised to be anti-communist during the Cold War. And what Americans didn't notice initially is that they were secretly being anti-American because of the shallowness, as they called it, the shallowness of the American culture, which many Germans disliked after 1945. So they had no choice. They were being re-educated, and this goes for the education system as well. So the whole curriculum was furnished. There were new books, new teachers, new teacher trainers, etc. Many people saw 1945, therefore, as a year where the continuity of the Nazi regime was changed by a new continuity, namely the democratic system imposed on the Germans by the Americans. But as we moved away from that time, we see that many traditions in mentality or in thought or in philosophy or in political behavior was well, not as discontinued as we believed it to be. So this myth of Stunde Null, so the 0 hour, the end of the Nazi era, with the death of Hitler and the fall of Berlin and the capitulation in May 1945, was more or less cannot solely be regarded as a discontinuity in German history. The German philosopher Horkheimer said that it has something to do with the basic German indifference, which had led to the rise of the Nazi Empire in the first place. So Germans adapt themselves to the changing circumstances. They had an empire, and then they had a democratic republic, and then there was this guy Hitler, and then they had a war, and now there are allied forces who try to make them to force them into democrats. And that's just, they just move along with the changed circumstances. That means that the famous notion of, I don't know how your German is, but this is a German, a very, well, infamous, famous German word, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which is basically to be translated as dealing with the past. How can Germans deal with this sad, dark past, which have just recently, done away with? And this is the central issue, basically, in the 1950s and the 1960s. How can you not forget about what happened to the Jews and to many people in Europe through Nazi oppression and Nazi terror? And this means that sometimes people tend to forget, wanted to forget about the whole situation, because you cannot deal with the past when you're, partly to be blamed for that past. And this was well reflected in a book published in 1967 by a German couple, psychologists, Mr. and Mrs. Mitscherlich. And the book is called The Inability to Mourn, Die Unfähigkeit zu trauern. And this dealt with this whole issue, this whole notion of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. How can you deal with such a tragic event as what happened between 1941 and 1945, or even between 1933 and 1945? So what does this book was about was the difference between mourning and remembering. And this couple said that it is very well, that German individuals are very well able to mourn their dead. So if your father was a soldier or an SS guard and he died in the 1950s, you could individually mourn for the loss of your father. And when you do that, this couple says, you try to loosen yourself from this person, because you have to forget the dead, not forget them altogether or completely, but you have to loosen your ties with him or her, because he's no longer there. He's no longer part of your life, completely part of your life. But with remembrance, it's a whole different issue, because remembrance, they say, is a collective ritualization of this individual mourning. In other words, you can individually mourn about the loss of one of your relatives, but you cannot, as a collective society, mourn about the loss of a whole generation, or the loss of a political system, or the loss of all the rituals you have attached with the Nazi era. So how can Germans in the 1950s collectively ritualize this loss of Nazi ruling? Because if you do that, you have to accept collective responsibility for all that happened, and all what happened is too big to collectively ritualize that. So it has taken the Germans a long time to set up monuments or museums which deal with this collective remembering of the Nazi era. And another notion which is brought in by Aleida Assmann, which is another German historian and philosopher, is the difference between the victims described in the Latin word of sacrificium and the Latin word of victima. And she says it's easier to mourn or to remember a sacrificium than a victima, because the sacrificium is something someone who loses his or her life for a larger goal, a bigger goal, like an ideology or state-backed violence. If a US soldier loses his life in Afghanistan or Iraq, that's easier to deal with, how sad it is that somebody loses his life, but that's easier to deal with than when somebody shoots someone in the streets of Washington. That would be a victima, a senseless victim. So here's the definition here is between a victim which is supported by state violence and a victim which is supported by non-regulated violence. And of course the Jews were victimas in this theory, and soldiers who lost their life on the battlefields of World War II were sacrificiums. So there were a lot of monuments attached to lost soldiers, to soldiers who died during World War II, but you could not, in the early days or in the first 2 or 3 decades, mourn your victimas. If I'm going too fast, just interrupt me.
No, it's fine.
Okay. So what basically happened in Germany in collective memory is that in the first 15 to 20 years, well, these dates are quite, are not completely derogatory, but they are, well, they are debatable. But in the first 15 to 20 years, what basically happened in Germany is that people, teachers, students, well, citizens ignored the past. And ignored the past, I mean ignoring the Nazi past. They could not deal with the collective remembering of this past. And in the period between 1960 and 1979, there were many young people, so the younger generation, the 1960s generation, as you prefer, let's say the German equivalent of the counterculture, confronted their parents or the older generation with this past. And they had to do that because there were a lot of public issues in this period which revived the Nazi past. To name a few, there were a number of anti-Semitic outbursts in West and East Germany, as there were in Poland and in other parts of Eastern Europe. For instance, in the winter of 1959-1960, where surviving Jews were attacked by Germans or non-Jewish residents in villages and in cities, where people were beaten up or killed or whatever. Secondly, a breakthrough was the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. As you know, Eichmann was brought back from Argentina by agents of the Mossad and trialed in Jerusalem. And during this trial there was a lot of attention to the Holocaust. Witnesses spoke out for the first time publicly. Eichmann was quoted in the press. There were a lot of journalists and press dealing with the trials, and a lot of new information on what actually happened in the death camp was published and made public. In Germany itself, there was a very important trial in Frankfurt in 1964, 1965. In fact, there were a couple of trials. The most important of which was the Auschwitz trial, where a number of former camp leaders, perpetrators, were trialed. As happened with camp leaders from Majdanek and Sobibor. So during the 1960s there were a number of public trials where perpetrators were prosecuted, and where witnesses were invited to speak what happened at the trial during their life in the camps. And this was for the first time in history that this actually happened on German soil, German territory. These new generations, however, were inspired by, well, let's say, neo-Marxist movement, like the Frankfurt Schule, the Horkheimer Adorno
Schule, school of thought, philosophical school of thought. And because of the neo-Marxist character of this, well, intergenerational conflict, as you might call it, there was little room for Jewish victimhood, because the Jews were still the victimized, and they were not part of the clash between the generations. So, in a way, you could say, and I'm exaggerating a bit, in a way you could say that the intergenerational conflict in Germany was fought over the backs of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. So there was a lot of attention for the Holocaust, but the attention mainly in Germany mainly went into the direction of an intergenerational conflict. 1979, the breakthrough of Jewish victimhood came with the broadcast of an NBC television series, Holocaust. That's the name of the series. A very dramatically exposed drama series. Have you ever seen parts of that television series? No. Is it well known where you come from?
No, Shoah is more well known.
Yeah.
Is that the one?
No, it isn't. No, Shoah was made by a Frenchman. And in fact, Shoah was a film made as a counterpart of Holocaust. So Holocaust was a Hollywood production, a typical Hollywood production with all the drama attached to it, and Shoah was a kind of a documentary, without sound, without music, without drama. There, this director interviewed survivors of the death camps without, exaggerating or romanticizing the whole issue. But in the Netherlands and in Germany, West Germany, the broadcast of this television series reopened the debate on the Holocaust extremely. So this was a turning point in post-war history of the Holocaust reception. Because this led to a situation where in Germany there was a lot of debates on normalization of dealing with their past, especially the Holocaust. And this meant as well that the suffering of the victims and the fact that normal Germans basically helped the perpetrators to get the Jews to their final destination was acknowledged for the first time. So this normalization debates, which took place in this period, meant that a lot of Germans had to acknowledge the fact that a lot of people were, in fact, involved in these crimes, and that bystanders and normal civil servants were actually taking part in the Holocaust, or had taken part in the Holocaust. What happened since the 1990s? A sort of competition and remembrance occurred. Who has got the worst victims, the East or the West? Of course, East Germany suffered from communism and from East German injustices or Soviet oppression. And there were concentration camps in East Germany. And there was a secret service, the Stasi, who committed a couple of crimes. So what actually happened was that West Germany battled the East Germans with a competition in sufferance. We had the Holocaust more than you did, and we had Nazi crimes more than you did. There was an eruption of monuments and of museums all over the East and all over the West, dedicated to either the Holocaust or to East German injustices. There's a historian, a German historian, who says, well, this is part of Hegelian theory. Yeah? So the thesis is there's an end of National Socialism in 1945. The antithesis will be, parts of National Socialism have survived in terms of people or ideas or politics. And the synthesis is that National Socialism is not gone, but that it's brought to a higher level, which means it is still visible, but you have to look harder to find it. And this is, of course, a very critical notion on German politics, because he says the notion of authoritarian view on politics is still present in German politics and in German history education. And the problem is in Germany that collective memory always has to deal with the recognition of guilt and responsibility for what happened during National Socialism. So National Socialism and the Holocaust is either denied or is acknowledged, but it's a part of collective memory of the Germans. In my country, the Netherlands, we have a standard narrative as well, of course. And the standard narrative here is that we were small and harmless, quiet and neutral. We are very traditional. Well, basically, people said in 1939, if the world collapses, you have to go to Holland because everything happens there 50 years later. So that's the basic notion of what people thought of themselves in this country. National coherence, tradition. And we were attacked in 1940 by the Germans because of a number of reasons. And we had nothing to do with the Holocaust. The highest percentage of European Jews taken away from their countries was here. 85% of the Dutch Jews were taken away to the death camps in the East. But we had nothing to do with it. It was a German-Jewish problem. And it took place on our territory, but, we stood there and could do nothing about it. That's basically how we feel about what happened during World War II. And we did the same thing. In the first 15 to 20 years, we ignored the past. The Jews who survived the death camps and came back to Holland came back to their own houses where other people lived, and they could not live in their own house anymore. And the things they had buried or hidden away, so properties in their houses or in their gardens, were taken by the Dutch. So the Jews were not welcome. Many Jews who survived Auschwitz or other camps moved back to Holland, stayed here for a couple of months, lost everything, their families and their properties, and then a large amount of them emigrated to Israel after 1948. So the Holocaust didn't exist in the Netherlands until the 1960s. And in the 1960s, like in Germany, the younger generation started to question the older generation. So what did you do to stop Jews from being transported to Poland? And the parents, of course, said, well, we could do nothing because we were threatened. We had no choice. We could just, we had to let them go. And somewhere during the 1960s and the 1970s, this perception of, we as innocent bystanders changed. And again in 1979, when this NBC drama series was broadcast in this country as well, people in the Netherlands started to deal with the Jews and the victims from the Dutch. That meant that somewhere during the 1990s, monuments were being built and constructed, and museums were being opened dedicated to Jewish victimhood. So until 1989, there were only 2 monuments in the whole of the country dealing with Jewish victimhood. After that, victimization of the Holocaust became essential. This had both an individual as a universal connotation attached. Individual because people knew Jewish victims, their neighbors or relatives or friends, and they testified openly about what happened to these people. And again, the Holocaust was attached to universal lessons on, democracy or human rights. Or if you look at Rwanda, what happened in Rwanda or in Cambodia or in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, the Holocaust was brought into that debate as a kind of a benchmark. So this will not happen. This might not happen if we would have, listened to what happened to the Jews during World War II. So what does it mean for textbooks, because my research is about how the Holocaust is reflected in textbooks. Well, as you know, that textbooks are very important instruments in developing common memory and national identities. Both countries where I'm looking at, so West Germany and the Netherlands, the Holocaust is used as part of this national identity, either as from a perpetrator point of view, so in West Germany, or from a victim's point of view, like in other countries. And textbook writing is trying to unite public collective memory with scholarship. And public collective memory is sometimes very different to scholarship. And that's a very complicated thing to look at, because, for instance, in the Netherlands, only 40% or 45% of all teachers and textbook writers are academics. And they have a larger distance to academic scholarship than in Germany, for instance, where every teacher is an academic. So what you see in German textbook is that the academic debate, the historical debate, is followed much more closely than in Dutch textbooks. Which means that the quality of German textbooks, as it comes to content, information, is a lot higher than what I found until today in the Dutch situation. I have to speed up a little bit. How much time do we have?
About 5 minutes. But you can take your time.
No, okay. I'll speed it up a bit. Well, there's a discussion going on for a long time about the difference between historical culture and memory culture. And sometimes people say that history is about showing multi-perspectivity on events, or that they're showing the ambiguity of certain, how would you say, interpretations of history. And memory is something which denies what they say the pastness of the event, because it tries to continue the event to the present day. And it has to, the Holocaust is a very important instrument in both cultures. It's studied historically by dealing with the multi-perspectivity of the Holocaust, or it has certain theories attached to the Holocaust. But in collective memory, it is just the other way around. It's showing a monocultural perspective on this event, like this 1970s series, The Holocaust. As some survivors said, like Eli Wiesel, you probably heard of him, he found this series to be cheap Hollywood production, untrue, offensive even. If you haven't been there, you don't know what it was like, some other guy said. So the right to testify about what happened in the death camps lies with the survivors only, and it's not something you make Hollywood productions of. That's what he said anyway. So if you look at museums and history textbooks in collective memory, they are presented as temples, so to speak, of the collective memory of that event. And I think one of the examples is the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, where you sure know of, where the victim is, let's say, sanctified in relation to the Holocaust. And multi-perspectivity is perhaps a bit lost in the presentation of the museum. Well, I haven't been to the museum for about a number of years, so it might have changed. I'm curious how you feel about that. Whereas in history culture, museums and textbooks are forums where people exchange their ideas and views upon certain historical events. And narratives are instruments in this, in this conveying of ideas and notions. Okay, well, let's move on a little bit more. What I found interesting is that a guy, James Wirtz, he's an American psychiatrist. He's coined the notion of abstract narrative templates. He says these are underlying schemes which don't change for a long time, and he mentions the scheme of the Russian history example. In Russian history, he says the underlying narrative template is that the country is being attacked by a foreign oppressor and that they heroically resist and they beat the oppressor fine in the end, and then they move back again to their glorious homeland. And this is what happened against Napoleon, this is what happened against Hitler, and this is what apparently happening now under Putin. This is a historical notion which is not liable to conscious reflection, he says. And collective remembering is entrenched, so it's part of this narrative template, this underlying scheme. So you have to dig deep to find the underlying schemes of this notion. What does it mean for the Holocaust, finally? Can you see this abstract, this figure? Is that visible?
Possible, but
Yeah,
small.
it's kind of tiny.
What I try to prove in my dissertation is that victims are not mentioned in most of the Holocaust representations or portrayals. So if it comes to historical scholarship mainly focuses on perpetrators and bystanders. For example, the publications of Christopher Browning, Dan Diner, well, you know them all. They are concentrating on what actually happened, how the Holocaust happened, and who took part in it. In textbooks, the same thing happens. They deal with perpetrators. Who were the people who worked in the camps? Why did they do it? How did they do it? Etc. Another portrayal in textbooks is that the Holocaust is used as a universal symbol, like I said, so universalization of the event. And only in collective memory, so in monuments and in some museums, victims get portrayed, really portrayed as victima, as innocent victims, in items or in manifestations of public culture. So, well, that's basically what I wanted to say to you.
Thank you. It was a fascinating presentation, and I'll now open the floor to the participant audience if you have any questions.
Hi, can you hear me? A little bit?
Yes, if you could speak up a little because you're far away from the mic.
Yeah, okay. I don't want to yell to everybody in here.
No.
So, this is very good. Thank you. I was really struck by some of the problems that are happening in the Netherlands today around this decision to avoid teaching the Holocaust because of being seen as a Zionist or maybe causing riots and so on. That was very, very powerful to hear that. And I wonder if you thought, in the way that Germany has been forced to grapple with its role as perpetrator, and then teach from that perpetrator perspective, whereas in Holland, while not the perpetrator, it sounds like the grappling with the role of handing over the Jews has been done very tentatively. Like in France, they're really having to address their collaboration, their collaboration. And in Amsterdam, I think there's a museum of resistance. There was a train track, I believe, where the Jews were taken from, and rather than making it a commemoration, they actually just removed track number 12, so you just don't have to deal with it. And I wonder if there's kind of some of what's happening today is symptomatic of the country's not yet finished grappling with the moral conundrum that the people were in and the way in which the Jews were handed over. I sense there is still some kind of denial somewhere. Because to hear that schools are afraid of being, afraid of teaching the Holocaust, and they're afraid of their own people. I mean, that in and of itself is a kind of symptomatic to me of something. Now, you know the culture better than I do. I've spent some time in Holland, but far more time in France, so I don't know the level that I'm talking about in terms of how much people are grappling with it, but I suspect that has something that the Dutch narrative does still not really deal, is still a victim narrative. Closely.
Yeah. Well, I agree, and I think it has something to do with a very typical social stratification of this country, because from the late 1900s until the 1960s, this country was being, basically divided into religious or into social groups attached to religion. For instance, Catholics had these huge communities where they weren't able to break out of that communities. They went to Catholic schools, read Catholic newspapers, had Catholic radio stations, Catholic football clubs. Well, everything they did was inside this Catholic community. And the same goes for Protestants and Social Democrats and liberals. So Jews were just another, segment of society, basically, and they were not entirely, were not integrated at all. So actually what happened in the 1940s when the Germans invaded the country and decided to impose anti-Jewish measures and, forcing them to leave the country or to live in ghettos, there was not anyone who protested because they were not part of Dutch society. They spoke the language, and some were, assimilated, but many of them had lived in separated communities for, over a century or even longer. And to give you an example, we have a prime minister who is an historian. He's a guy, in his 40s. So he studied history, and he was asked how he felt about the Hollandse Schouwburg in Amsterdam, which was the place, it was a former theater where the Jews were rounded up, and from there they were brought to a camp in the east of the country, and from that camp they were moved to Auschwitz, and he didn't know what it was. So he didn't know that the theater was a monument commemorating Jewish victimhood in the Netherlands during World War II. This is a national monument. And the Prime Minister is a historian, but he didn't know what it was. So still, Jewish victimhood is in a way ignored, you could say, even by professional historians.
It seems like a similar challenge today of having Muslims be a separate community in the Netherlands, and this idea of not yet being able to recognize, and we all have it in our own cultures in our own way, other as self, that there is no separate culture. There are people being taken away to be killed, whether they're Jewish or Hispanic or Muslim or what have you. But this idea that, my understanding that there's still very intact communities that are quite insular.
Yeah, true. Well, the same goes, of course, for the Muslim minorities in this country, because they get to teach, in history education, there's a large discussion, what should we do with people who originate from Morocco, from Turkey, from Somalia, Afghanistan, Bosnia, whatever, people from different cultural backgrounds. When we impose our Western views and our Western history curriculum, for instance, upon these people, and they don't relate to this notion at all, because at home or within the families they get very different cultural backgrounds, which are sometimes completely opposed to what they learn at school. So the curriculum has to change. Many people believe, we have to adapt our curriculum to the needs of students who come from different backgrounds. And there are schools in some cities which have 80-90% non-Dutch cultural minorities. So it makes them a majority, of course.
Right. So when we speak, you speak about history textbooks a lot. That's like a focus of your research. I'm wondering what can you do in terms of curriculum and textbooks to include these other perspectives, because in my own research I found that the history that the students are learning at home is quite different from the history that they hear in the classrooms. So are these the right tools? Curricula and textbooks that we can include this multi-perspectivity and try to introduce some kind of positive attitudes and change, or what is there anything else that
well, if I didn't quite understand your question, Boslava, because your voice was falling away. But what you're asking is what I want to do with the outcome of my research for the curricula.
Well, yeah. I also compared it to my own research. I'm defending my dissertation soon, and it's also on comparing the narratives from the history textbooks with the individual narratives of people on the ground, of students.
Yeah.
And what I found is that people on the ground, grassroots, they have different kind of narratives. They are not replicating narratives that are in the book. So are the textbooks, curricula, the right tools, to introduce some kind of positive change, multi-perspectivity, or we need to do something more, something else? I just would like to hear your ideas.
Yeah, well, that's a difficult one. Of course, textbooks are very important instruments to convey, national narratives in this case, or certain narratives about a certain topic. And I think we must not underestimate the impact that textbooks have on students, on children, because that if a child reads something, he considers it to be true, unless somebody says that it might be just another construction of an historical event. On the other hand, we do not know exactly, at least not to my knowledge, on this topic, is about how teachers deal with the textbooks they use. So how do they convey the information in the textbooks to their students, and how do they portray the multi-perspectivity of the event through the perhaps monocausal or mono-perspective from the textbooks. So I think that's something to be researched more thoroughly, is how textbooks are actually used by students and teachers, and how this, assumed to be instrumental issue can be rediverted into something more less problematic. What I feel is that if you would include historical discussions on, in this case the Holocaust, in textbook curricula or in textbooks, like showing the discussions on the Holocaust or whatever topic you could have in textbook contents, this might help to see, to make students see that in certain eras there were other opinions on this matter than in our times. I think this is, this doesn't happen in the Netherlands or in Germany. But the history of history education might be an interesting way of showing students that actually perceptions and perspectives change over the years. This is something which is not happening in Japan, I think. If I'm
I wanted to ask you from the Japanese, and especially in the context of Japan-China relations. I was fascinated by your distinction or different framing of approach, collective memory approach and historical approach. And in speaking about the Holocaust, that event itself, there is not a debate on the parties, who the perpetrators are and who the victims are. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to an event where parties are contesting the party identity itself, for example, in the case of Japan-China, there's a debate of even the denialism of Japanese perpetratorhood, and then there's a Chinese identity of a victim. but this narrative or memory of the event itself is contested between the parties. And so when the parties themselves are contesting about their own involvement in the event, and if the political stakes are also involved today, from the perspective of Japanese the collective narrative or collective memory, to admit that there's the perpetrator identity in Japan, for example, in the case of Nanjing massacre, 1938, it's a for some people it is admission of moral defeat. It's a concession to admission of responsibility, and then to admit that we were wrong, despite the fact that we have been thinking that we were right. And so, in this case, when there are parties to the event itself, it seems to me there's in-group collective memory and out-group collective memory, the competing ones. And if the political interest are at stake and defies this approach, historical approach, to be able to have a multi-perspective, multi-approach. What you mentioned about the collective memory being entrenched is intentionally reinforced, politically sanctioned. How is it possible to depoliticize when there are competing, contesting parties are involved in the event itself? Unlike Holocaust, unlike the event where people agree who the perpetrators are, who the victims are. So I was just curious to try to find some implications from your theoretical, conceptual background to where I'm from.
Okay. Well, you might have heard of the Israeli-Palestinian history textbook, or the French-German or the German-Polish textbook. These are interesting examples of what you actually mentioned. For instance, the Israeli-Palestinian textbook is developed by a joint committee of Israeli and Palestinian historians and history teachers. And after a long debate, I think it took them about 5 or 6 years, and it was difficult to get together even, because it was impossible to join in Jerusalem because there was too much political opposition to these people joining together. But after a couple of years, they've come up with a Palestinian-Israeli textbook on the history of Israel, or Palestine. And the textbook consists of 3 parts. On the left side of the page is the Israeli version of certain events, like the 6 Days War, or the creation of the State Israel. On the right-hand side of the page is the Palestinian or Arabic version of the event. And in the middle, there's a blank page or blank space where students can comment on both perceptions of the same historic event. Of course, this approach has advantages and disadvantages, but what's good about this, I think, is that students in Israel or in Palestinian areas see these multiple perspectives on the same historical event on one page, which provides them with opportunities to comment and to have their own, historical perspective on these events. And the same happens with the French and the Germans. They have a combined French-German textbook. The left page is in German and the right page is in French. And they don't present opposing views or contested views on historical events, but they just have a bilingual approach of the same history of both countries, or about the second 20th century European history or whatever. Does such a thing happen, could easily happen in Japanese-Chinese relations, do you think?
It is possible. There was an effort of creating a joint history textbook, but I'm not sure how far they went. And it's certainly not implemented in the actual school context. I think in 1990s the effort was combined to produce a report. So the report was done, but not implemented as an actual practice. The history, the joint history narratives, where Chinese scholars and Japanese scholars came together and then wrote about the events from their own perspectives. And so I'm glad to hear this examples from other contexts. And I'm curious to hear if you know about any reactions when the students found new perspective, and then you discovered the possibility that their historical memory or the consciousness could have been wrong or could have been biased. What kind of reactions and impacts were observed? Have you come across those observations?
Well, I'm not sure about the. I've spoken to a few teachers who use the Israeli and Palestinian textbook in Israel, but I'm not sure about the observations they made of their students and how it affected students' opinions on historical events. What I do know is that in the German-French regions of where they speak both German and French, so that's a very small community at the French-German border. There are, a couple of occasions where students from both countries meet and exchange their views and perceptions of their joint history. So they're called history weekends, and they they organize historical discussions guided by their teachers, and they have joint sport sessions and musical evenings and stuff like that. Just fraternity of nations, basically. But it's only limited to a small number of people because you have to speak both languages in order to understand each other. In Yugoslavia, Borislavia, would that be possible to present a multiple perspective?
Well, they tried. There was this Clio project, if you know Euro Clio, that's the organization. And they actually created history textbooks where teachers came and they tried to create this joint narrative. But that didn't really get any traction on the ground. In my research, what I found is that the history is so much contested, and I interviewed students and teachers in Eastern Slavonia, and they're basically rejecting history because they see it as something that is divisive for their community. So many students are just rejecting history as a tool for creating divisions and stereotypes.
Yeah.
But communities are still divided. The schools are segregated. Some of the schools are segregated. So really, it's a difficult process. But what's interesting for me is what you said, that after the Second World War, and there was kind of a silence in the Netherlands and Germany about what happened. But for example, Croatia, it was after the war, the books, the history textbooks were very, radicalized. They were very stereotypical and dichotomous narratives. Us, we are victims, they are aggressors, and so on. And the tension is reduced a little bit now, but it still exists. So why this silence, took place in these societies? Well, in the Balkans it was quite the opposite. And I think you also mentioned that. Well, if you have any ideas, I don't know the answer, but it's one anomaly, I guess.
Sorry, say that again, the last one?
I think it's an anomaly.
Yeah, it is normal. Yeah. Well, what is basically what is very important, I think, is that we have to show students that every interpretation of history is a construction, and there are a lot of means through which people can construct history. And if you can deconstruct this construction by giving them materials to analyze and show or see the multiple layers which this construction involves on, I think you can take away a lot of stereotypes and generalizations about historical interpretations. I was in Slovenia shortly after the Yugoslav war, and there was a new national museum in Ljubljana about Slovenian history. That was very interesting because it was like a temple, basically, a temple of Slovenian nationalism, aimed against, oppression or stressing Slovenian national identity. I found that amazing and understandable at the same time, but that was quite a eye-opener. That was somewhere in around 1998 or 1997. I don't know when. Clearly a construction of history again. But how do you feel about the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington? Was I wrong in my observations on the?
What did you? I didn't hear what you said about the museum. What did you say?
When I visited the museum in it was in 2000 or 2001. I had the impression that it was demonstrating basically the Jewish victimhood very strongly, without offering the public layers of other interpretations. Like showing anti-Semitism before the war, or how Jews survived the war and what happened with Jews after the war. Perhaps that changed, but it stressed the suffering a lot.
The first couple floors, you start on the top and you come down, if you remember.
Yeah.
Talks about the very slow rise of Nazism and how it happened, and not really even from a Jewish perspective, but how was it so successful? And it's very seductive, and it's hard to believe. You're going along, and you're surprised to find yourself in the Holocaust, maybe in the way that people in Europe were surprised to find themselves in the Holocaust. So for me, it did build that slowly. Now, by the end, there's no post. And if you can even make it to the end, each time I get there, it's hard to even get through, because the end is the worst. The end is the worst, and the end is the Holocaust itself. And some survivors talk about their stories of surviving, but they talk about them in a way that breaks your heart. They're almost hard to listen to. So, and the Elie Wiesel quotes that are chosen are not ones of resilience. They are one of his quotes is something about, it broke something in me that was eternal. Like that, that it broke your soul, not just that it ruined your life. The death even wouldn't have been a way out. And these are very haunting narratives. So no, it's not a cheery. There's no end. Therefore, what? You're kind of left with I don't know what. Every time I leave there, I'm just kind of lost for like a day or two, just to kind of I don't know what to make of it. So I agree with you on the second part. The first is that it does show a very slow rise, my perspective was you could see how many people could get seduced into it, right? And I'm Jewish, but so that's how I experienced it. But your experience is just as valid. The museum itself has not changed, so if you felt something was missing, it may not have been there. So.
Well, perhaps I was too overwhelmed with the whole tragedy of the exposition, basically. Like you said, human suffering is really omnipresent in the museum. And I was struck by, when reading Peter Novick, the American Life and the Holocaust, he said he wondered, he was a Jewish scholar, he wondered why it was that there was a huge Holocaust museum in the United States, whereas there isn't a huge slavery museum in the United States, or a museum for the remembrance of the Native Americans or whatever happened to Native Americans.
So we have a Native American one. The answer to the other question is that Jews just have more money than blacks and power.
Yeah.
I mean, we have the Native American Museum, but that's part of processing that there is one in D.C. But the slavery one is a great question. It's a great question anyway, even if there is an answer, or there are answers. It's a great question.
Yeah.
But then the question of what does a museum of suffering serve, right? I mean, that's these questions that a lot of people are raising. Like, do we need to keep going through the story again and again and again? And I don't know, is learning about history divisive? Like, I think the people that you, it's a really interesting question. I don't know what you guys think.
It's a debate.
Yeah,
I was also struck by your mentioning these movies and series and how they shifted and how they actually started the conversation between generations. That was striking that like Holocaust series can actually do, so as a cultural product can stir the debate. So in a way, there are different tools, not necessarily museums, but there are different tools through which we can keep the memory of these events alive, because I think it's important to keep this so that people can debate, can see what is right and wrong, and I guess teach the future generations. So I don't think necessarily history textbooks or a movie or anything, but you never know what kind of cultural product can stir this debate. But as long as they're happening, I think they're important.
Mm. Yeah, that's true. Well, currently we have a couple of Holocaust survivors who are in their 90s now, and they travel around the country to visit schools and speak to students about their experiences. And of course, this has a huge impact on on young people, because they know the stories and they know what happened. But if they hear it from this fragile 91-year-old woman or man, and he or she tells about the suffering and the humiliation and the violence, this of course has an enormous impact on students. But there was a survey last year or 2 years ago here in this country, doing exit interviews with students who just came out of the classroom with a Holocaust survivor, trying to grasp the impact of this lesson or this hour conversation with this man. And about 65-70% of the students believed that it didn't reinforce or change their opinion on the Holocaust or on Germans or on the Nazis. So it was basically a confirmation of what they actually knew from the teachers of the textbooks. But it was a very emotional experience, on the other hand, of course, for many youngsters.
I don't even know if when I hear from survivors if it changed my view on Germans, but it makes me think about humanity and life differently. I'm curious what other questions they ask. How do you see your own mortality? How do you see humanity? How do you see your role in the world? And something else, some other question.
Yeah. No, I'm saying this because until quite recently, until 10 years ago, the attitude of the attitude of Dutch young people towards Germans, so the neighbors, was quite negative. So many Dutch students associated Germans still with World War II and Nazism and the Holocaust and concentration camps and all kinds of historical dark historical sides. And there was no new information about what happened in Germany after World War II, which sort of reshaped their image of Germany, apparently. So the Dutch government decided to establish a German information center to adjust the perspective of Germany by Dutch youngsters, and they apparently succeed in doing that because the last survey was much more positive towards the Germans. Of course, Germany is a very important economic partner and political neighbor of the Dutch. So there are economic and political ties involved as well.
If we can use these political and economic ties to promote peace, and positive attitude, that would be great.
Well,
that's what we are trying to do here at ICAR.
So we're trying to
I wanna get back to the question of the teachers. You mentioned that on the Dutch side there's a 40% academic, and on the German side it's 100% academic, writing the history. That's a striking percentage on the German side, and I'm curious to know how happened that on the German side people who are writing on this historical the narratives come from were trained as an academic that you were to do so.
yeah. Yeah, well, I don't know why it happened, but there's a strong academic tradition in Germany anyway, so there's a lot of prestige attached to academic scholarship in Germany, much more so than in the Netherlands. But anyway, if you want to become a teacher in Germany, you have to do a academic course like Germanistic or history or whatever. Then you get a teacher training course, which takes you for about 1.5 to 2 years. And then you have to do an internship at a school, and if you're qualified and if they accept your professionality, then you're able to teach somewhere in the country. So it's quite a long way of fulfilling your requirements. Whereas in the Netherlands you can have a postgraduate, post-college education, history training and pedagogical, didactical training for 3 or 4 years, and you'll become a second degree teacher, which means you can teach undergraduates. And if you have an academic career as well, you can have a first degree, teaching degree, which means you can teach everyone.
So in Germany they stress scholarship, I guess, put more stress on the process.
PhDs are respected at another level that they aren't here. If you're a professor, if you're a doctor, it's really serious. Yeah, here it's arrogant elitist.
Especially in DC.
Yeah, right? Dime a dozen.
And any more questions?
This is terrific. I didn't even get your name.
Mark. Umberto.
Borislava knows where to find me, so
you're welcome. Can I share your email, your details with the group?
Of course, please be my guest. I'm looking forward to hear from you, and I'm very interested in your research projects because I haven't heard anything about you. Well, I definitely must come to the US one day, and we'll have a proper get together then.
You're welcome. So, okay, so let's finish. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, and please stay in touch. We'll send you questions, comments.
Right.
And, yeah. So.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you for having me and inviting me. And well, I hope you have a fruitful event afterwards, and many more discussions on this topic. And Borislava, I wish you well in your presentation, your defense of your dissertation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.